Good evening, virtuous ones. Professor Carey Harrison was born in London, raised there, and in New York and the continent. Studied at Harrow, Cambridge, has written many books, plays, has taught at a number of American universities, and is now a professor of English at Brooklyn College. That's one kind of introduction. We've heard that kind a lot. Behind that introduction stands one of the most interesting people I've ever had the good fortune to meet. A man who I got to know through reading a novel of his called Richard's Feet, which was one of a series, perhaps of 4 novels, perhaps more, dealing with some of the same characters, some of the same situations, but in no sense a series. Not a Palliser series, not a Trollope kind of thing, but a taking on different parts of a world that was quite interesting. A world that begins back in the old places in the old days and carries forward. Carey Harrison has done everything, I suppose, would be the simplest way of saying it. From slow bowling and county cricket to covert operations for the African National Congress back in the days when they were struggling successfully against the apartheid regime in South Africa, where he played very dangerous games, even more dangerous than cricket, I think. Carey has been everywhere, has spoken in many places and in many tongues, speaks many, many languages. He's written many novels and over 200 plays, he tells me, or they tell me, some of which you have seen on PBS Masterpiece Theatre presentations. But none of that kind of external material tells you about this extraordinary man whose father was a world-famous actor, whose mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen on the screen, who grew up to do all kinds of things, everything from raising goats, which he didn't want me to mention, to writing operas, which is even more scandalous in this day and age than goats. A man whose grandfather was a prisoner at Auschwitz and was released right at the end of the war when the Russians were champing down the Eastern Line defenses. The Germans let the poor Jews go, quote, go, and said, go. Lecha, I guess is what they said, like a good Abrahamic command. And his grandfather was among the Jews who were sent out to walk in winter from Auschwitz in Poland to Budapest in Hungary. And Carey was the kind of man who has a quality that used to be called pietas, not piety at all, but a sense of responsibility to who one is and from whom one comes, the people who are behind one. So one day, just after I met him, he decided he would spend one winter walking barefoot, not so to speak, not barefoot, but on foot, from Budapest to Auschwitz to return the favor. Georg Lukács talks about the short story as about an episode or an event. The novella as about a person's life and development, perhaps. The novel is not about people at all, but about the world in which they operate. Let's welcome Carey Harrison and the world he opens to us with his latest novel.
Thank you so much for coming. My gosh. And I'm aware of what possibly follows us. When you feel Mozart calling, just melt away. And I fully understand. I'll also try not to go on for too long. I'm as anybody would be, speechless after an introduction like that, and I want to say, but I'm just a little boy. Because as you will totally feel yourself to be, little girl, when you reach my age. So none of that seems to be about you. So this book I want to dive into quickly. It's huge, as you can see, and were I to try and describe some of its themes and stories, I would never get around to reading. But the main character, a chap called Rowley Watkins, the first big event in his life, he is in charge of one of his mother's lovers, because this man, a wonderful man, is a bipolar schizophrenic, paranoid schizophrenic, who Rowley adores, but who is not entirely responsible human being. And his mother has asked him to look after this delinquent person, who at one point drags him down to southwest France. Rowley is raised in Paris by his Russian ex-dancer mother, who has a lot of friends, of boyfriends. And this one drags Rowley down to the deep caves of southwest France, and in an imaginary cave called Saint-Sulpice des Eaux. Rowley falls from a great height on the hillside down a shaft. His mother's lover, in effect his stepfather, is convinced that there are other holes and ways into this cave, and that the French are hiding from people the great subterranean treasures that they know exists, but they refuse to show the tourists. And while they're looking, poor Rowley falls and has some terrifying experiences during the fall, because he's suspended opposite a terrifying wall cave painting. And finally, he tumbles into a corner of the chamber known as the rhinoceros ceiling, where a hole barely large enough for a man's body to slide through, a body smaller in build than mine, as no doubt many Paleolithic bodies were, is hidden by a small overhang of rock. Mercifully, I was knocked unconscious, this is Rowley speaking, by my headlong fall. I say mercifully because I doubt if my wits would have survived a night with my head sticking down into the chamber, as apparently it was. It fell to the first tour group of the following morning to discover me, and in particular to a girl from Trenton, New Jersey, called Bernadette Dunlop, known as Bunny. Being independent-minded, Miss Dunlop had strolled away from the tour guide and the accompanying group to get a different perspective on the rhinoceros ceiling. "Excuse me," she apparently called until she got the guide's attention. "Hello, excusez-moi. Pardonnez-moi, everybody, mais regardez up there. Behind the very little rhinoceros, doesn't that shape look exactly like a man's head sticking down out of the ceiling? Isn't that curious? Does that mean something, do you think?" At that moment, I dare say, my earth-smeared head evoked a human head, rather than actually resembled one. Thus, Bunny Dunlop, who was not only to become my wife, but was in a literal sense my salvation. What if in subsequent tours, I can't resist this particular what if, over days and weeks and years, no one had ever wandered away from the group, typical of Bunny, to do this, thank God, in order to get a different perspective on the rhinoceros ceiling? The earth encasing my head and torso would have hardened into mud and ultimately into stone. I would now be part of the ceiling, so to speak. Prehistoric Man, Our Contemporary, is one of André Leroi-Gourhan's best-known works. I would have been a version of that, a contemporary prehistoric exhibit. There have been some strange and memorable first encounters in human history, but I defy anyone to improve on ours, Bunny's and mine. Many men might say that their wife was, metaphorically speaking, their discoverer. But will any have been first seen or discovered by their prospective wife while hanging upside down, unconscious, with their head poking through a frieze of Stone Age rhinoceri? That's how Rowley meets his beloved Bunny. Now, later in the story, many hundreds of pages later, when Rowley's life is adrift and he's really at the very bottom of the sump of his existence, he comes upon, on the sidewalk in South London, in Brixton, a flyer under his foot. And the flyer, which changes his life, the flyer says, Paleotherapeutics, a lecture on the practical application of prehistoric shamanism today, by Dr. Patrick Leahy, reader and docent in German philology at the University of Heidelberg and the Collège de France. Kennington Town Hall, Saturday, 5 p.m., July 26th. So this immediately attracts Rowley's attention, although he's had nothing to do with caves since his first encounter with them. So he goes to the lecture in Kennington Town Hall, a place where you would only expect to find extreme cranks, and this certainly sounded like one of those. Paddy Leahy, at first sight, seemed to be a kind of human hamster. Small, round and furry, he was wearing his thick Carey tweed jacket, even in July, of a dark bluish grey. His round, full-cheeked and small-featured face exuded a hobbity friendliness and diffidence. If I may make so bold, was the phrase he most often used in his lecture, and it turned out in ordinary life, even when introducing the least contentious propositions. Nothing personal, no offense. With all due respect, peppered his replies to questions as though he had spent his life giving offense. Most unlikely, I thought, in view of his timid and endearing manner, and had evolved this placatory style from long and painful experience. I could picture him as a hamster in the wild, scurrying between the legs of predators, murmuring, no offense, weasel, nothing personal, hawk, with all due respect, owl. When I came to know Paddy, he followed so many remarks with the coda, and I don't mean that as an insult, that I finally suggested to him that it should be engraved on his tombstone. Here lies Dr. Patrick Leahy, and I don't mean that as an insult. As comically unimposing a figure as Dr. Leahy was, his persona and the effect he had on his listeners changed completely as soon as he was delivered to intellectual passion. When he clambered onto the little stage, his whole body seemed to be begging us not to confuse him with anyone we might have come to hear, and I thought he might be a town hall employee who was quietly scuttling forward so as to adjust the microphone stand to suit the tall, formidable paleotherapist who was waiting off stage. Having lowered the microphone, tapped it, and uttered into it a series of tentative inquiries as to whether he could be heard at the back, there were only a dozen of us present, with one elderly lady in the very back row, by the door as though waiting to see whether she was in the right place or not. He cleared his throat, peered at us over his glasses, smiled, and, to my astonishment, "This is Patrick Leahy," began. I can't speak for the rest of the bizarre crew who were present on that memorable for me, occasion. Weirdos, I was going to call them, and probably I looked like a weirdo too. Apart from my suit, worn over a t-shirt, I was an unwholesome sight. Weeks of poring over The Dod's Tale, something you would get to know if you get closer to grips with this novel, in a darkened room, having finally reduced my Sri Lankan tan to a sickly yellowish color. My unkempt hair was also a lot longer than the 1980s would regard as acceptable in a youngish man moving with the times. Sitting around me that day in Kennington Town Hall were the lonely and the mad, the unemployed and the elderly, plus a few sincere autodidacts drawn by strange long words. I can be specific about them because they were precisely the choir, as Bunny would put it, to which I myself was soon preaching, and I came to know them by their name, their number, and their tribe of origin. As I say, I can't speak for the rest of the company that afternoon, but for my part, I was so electrified by Paddy's lecture that I can remember it almost word for word. It spoke straight to my soul as though he'd written it for me, or even at times as though I'd written it for him, in some inspired moment that I'd forgotten as soon as the fit had passed. His tiny black eyes shone as soon as he started to speak, to read, I should say, from his notes, but he barely glanced at them. His gaze would have been enough to hold us spellbound, but in his soft, compelling Carey voice was the sound of a bard advising a foolish high king in the courts of old. This new person, this bard hidden in a yokel's clothing, he was quite unplaceable in age, anything between 30 and 55, and I detected that at once that Paddy Leahy was one of those people who had looked middle-aged even as a child, was calm, sublimely certain now that he was on his own ground. In that instant, he had ceased to be the frightened hamster, as thoroughly as if in a blinding puff of sulphur he had turned into a taloned eagle. This was a bard, unafraid to die for his opinions. "Dear fellow cavemen," Dr. Leahy began, "and cave woman." This caused the dozen or so of us clustered at the front to glance at each other in closer inspection than before, and then, realizing with mild surprise that we were all of the same gender, to turn to the back row where the lone elderly woman sat, who had chosen it specifically in the hope of avoiding notice, and who now had been singled out to become the focus of the entire audience's attention. "But what could I do?" Paddy said later. "No offense to her, but she was the only woman, and I could neither ignore nor in all conscience pluralize her. Welcome," he plunged on, "to our postmodern cave, hung as it is with notices about legal aid and rubbish collection times, rather than paintings of antelope and rhinoceri." Rhinoceri. Had Dr. Leahy recognized me already? Cried my alarmed and excited heart. Apart from the rhino in the gas-bedeviled shaft at Lascaux, the only Stone Age portraits of this animal were on my very rhinoceros ceiling at Saint-Sulpice-des-Eaux, where I too had been, and surely forever was, a kind of honorary rhinoceros. For surely, in a very real sense, indeed, in the most profound sense, the great underground cathedrals of 20,000 years ago were each in their way the meeting house and social focus of the tribe, the hidden agora, the rathaus, the ayuntamiento, in the case of Altamira, say, or the mairie. Lascaux is really Lascaux Town Hall. He had my complete attention. This was all for me. I was this message's true destinataire, its addressee. At the back of my mind, I confess, I felt a small nagging impatience with some of Paddy's more banal rhetorical flourishes. My dad always said that the only people who used the phrase "in a very real sense" were Anglican priests and con men. But Paddy's intensity and bardic voice was sweeping me downstream regardless. Yet what, we might ask ourselves, was transacted in the bowels and council chambers of the Magdalenian earth? Not, we may take it, a vote on the future of certain condemned properties, shortly to be purchased by councilmen on the sly, or on the contract for the construction of a new sewage plant to be awarded to the mayor's son-in-law. Did "point of honor, Mr. Chairman" echo across the vaulted ceilings of Lascaux? No, my friends. Was there even language in these temples of devotion? Did one caveman say to another, "That's a pretty fair antelope you drew today, Arthur"? Or, "Pass the red pigment, would you, Harry? I've run out." Very possibly not. Some of the most brilliant and most daring theorists of prehistory have recently argued that graphology preceded grammatology, that art preceded speech. And this, my friends, my good and kind friends who have sacrificed your Saturday afternoon sport or entertainment, or both, thanks to the combined images and speech conveyed by television, in order to hear an obscure thaumaturge expound to you a new therapeutic doctrine. This is where I, as a philologist, come in. When does language enter the human story? What use was it other than to say, "Look behind you"? Or, What happened to the axe head I lent you last week? What use is it now, other than to interpose between us and our most profound intuitions about reality, a cobweb of ideas, an interminable static of arbitrary but dogmatic sounds? Language helps us order lunch. But does it help us experience lunch more fully? Is the stew a more meaningful, more memorable stew because of the words you sprinkle on it? Is the purpose of life to describe it more vividly or to live it more vividly? My friends, I have made myself as unpopular in my own little backyard of philology by proclaiming the inspirational lessons of dyslexia, as my good friend, the great Dr. R.D. Lang of Glasgow, has in his own profession by animadverting to the wisdom of schizophrenia. What is dyslexia? Do we have in our audience today a person who has been stigmatized by the word dyslexic? You, sir? Thank you. Thank you for your courage in declaring yourself. Dr. Leahy seemed to be addressing someone in front of and to the right of me who, if he made a sign at all, must have done so in a restrained manner. Perhaps no one had made a sign at all. Who could be sure? Such tricks of the soapbox speaker's trade were certainly a part of Leahy's repertoire. Society would have me regard you as a victim of mental malfunction, in much the same as I myself, clumsy on the sports field, am a victim of poor coordination. I hoped Dr. Leahy was noting my vigorous nod of empathy. But that's because Rowley is singularly clumsy. But I refuse to lump you with the disabled when you say, after tasting the aforementioned stew, kindly pass the elephant, instead of, as you intended, kindly pass the salt. I say you are neither a cripple nor a dolt, but a whistleblower, a natural, albeit involuntary pataphysician, exposing the intrinsic absurdity and incommensurateness of language itself. For is the word salt any closer to the nature, the physical or metaphysical properties, or even the appearance of salt than the word elephant would be? True, we have agreed, and centuries have sanctioned the agreement, to call the thing we sprinkle on our stew salt. But we have agreed not to sprinkle our stew with elephant. But I say that every time you utter pass the elephant, you compose a verbal Magritte, an evanescent reminder that ceci n'est pas une pipe, as the great René wrote on his picture of a pipe. The picture is not the thing. The word is not the thing. Language is a currency, and with it we acquire the use value of things by naming them. And at that very instant, the resistant otherness of things is disclosed, as Heidegger might say, in its hiddenness and concealed by its disclosure. To say salt, when you mean salt, is to make the truth of salt disappear, and the lie of salt become manifest. To call salt elephant is to violate the trust that underwrites all currencies. You might as well say, I call this pound note 1,000 pounds, and it is if I say it is. But to call salt elephant is also to restore to salt the truth of its hiddenness, so long trampled and colonized by language. Yes, language is a currency, and currencies are intended not to be true but to be useful. Let us by all means use that currency. I'm using it now, but let us not fetishize it, my friends. We use money, but just because it is a useful currency doesn't mean that we should worship money. I shall let you into a secret. Those of us who acquire language most swiftly in childhood do so because we are alarmed, appalled even by what our senses have told us about the world around us, far from being bold, able explorers. You, sir. Good God, he was pointing at me. And you, and possibly every one of you here, word children, for why else would the word paleotherapeutics have drawn you to hear a speaker unknown to you? Yes, word children that you are the wary, the damaged, the plotters of revenge. In words, your infant psyche saw a way to lay siege to experience, which had so far proved so unyielding and so threatening, so cold and empty and unkind, or so hot, vicious and claustrophobic. You would throw a net of words over the beast. You would people the icy emptiness with words. You would bind your wounds with words. Others, people unlike you, sent out their antennae into the Martian landscape of the world and found purchase, wet, fecund, warmth, a welcome. Words could wait. They were busy, these little happy natives of their domestic planet, breathing, living, eating, and drinking in an environment they trusted. Words in time could be attached to that environment and used not as a lifetime, but as a convenience. We met no nourishment, no such nourishment, you and I. Oh yes, I too am a word child, which means orphan. I read aloud from a medical dictionaries before the age of 3. Everyone found that interesting. Far from interesting was what I had sacrificed to develop that hypertrophic gift, hypertrophique, distorted growth, big head, stunted senses. Or rather, no, not stunted. We orphans are every bit as sensitive to our surroundings as the children of a happy planet. We simply found ours bleak and sang ourselves to sleep. If we could pin a name to the desolation that encircled us, we would distance it, we could distance it, master it, control it perhaps, at least reduce our fear, because who can be afraid of a thing that has a name, as we are of a thing that has none? For us, you see, words are a spell, not a description. And we become masters of this great edifice of language that others inhabit, that they put on and discard like clothing, but which for us is our skin, our lungs, our air. Take language from us and we die. Yet what is it, language? Only a substitute for life, an artificial home, a diorama in which we have imprisoned ourselves so that we can live and breathe at all. An oxygenated spacesuit, it's a beautiful fraudulent existence, and we know it for the poor thing it is compared to life itself, this life of ours filtered through words. So when my friend here says, pass the elephant, he punctures the charade of language, and I bless him because he points to Eden. Knowing what he means, for in truth, emperor language has no clothes, we pass him the salt. My friends, I love language. It has been my career, my religion even. But I stand before you an apostate. When I came to a crossroads in my life, to a moment of crisis which threatened to tear me apart, the signposts bore in on me, pointing in every possible direction and speaking in a host of familiar tongues. Linguist, hear thyself. I could hear nothing but a cacophony of words and ideas dividing me into 100 parts, all arguing with each other over my stunned and powerless body. Words which had been my life, which I had mastered in so many languages and driven like a team of obedient circus horses, now turned on me, dragging me in the dust like the defeated rider in Ben-Hur. Now these languages filled the sky, returned as scavenging birds to caw and peck at me. All I had to protect myself with was metaphor, but metaphor had broken down. I tried to think and write my way out of my agony. Anyone here who has been torn between love and duty will know the hell I mean, whose details I need not divulge to you. But instead, words foundered in the day and rose up in my sleep so that I woke exhausted by my writing dreams. In place of the jumbled yet spontaneous and healing ritual of our night revels, my mind continued writing, even in my dreams, which were composed of sentences and paragraphs without meaning or end. I might compare this to those film montages where, to convey the passing of time or a change of landscape or both, a letter-writing hand is superimposed on images of countryside or travel or battle, and script on a diagonal and covers a semi-transparent page as the images flicker behind it. But this is a tranquil, sympathetic yoking of image and word. In my dreams, the dreams themselves were being fed into a kind of mental typewriter which chewed and shredded and emitted words where scenes should be. The premise for a dream, its colors and its characters, became in dream the premise for a sentence. The cast was syntax. I, the dreamer, fought to coordinate them into a meaningful order. What I was dreaming all night, it seemed, was the compulsive rendering of my life into language. Like typewriter keys pounding life into words, like hooves pounding a senseless body, I had become an engine for stamping out my viscera and replacing them with proclamations. I was going mad, of course. At the time, I was on holiday with my family. And Paddy goes on to describe the climactic experience that he had, which took place in a cave. And after the lecture, Rowley chases after him in the street. I knocked over my chair as I dived along the row, hoping to catch him before he vanished like the white rabbit into his burrow. "What was the name of the cave?" I called as I saw him scurrying away from me down the town hall steps. "Where you fainted. Was it Saint-Sulpice des Eaux?" I saw him pause and ran to catch up with him. "Do you know it?" he asked. And then, as my features came into focus, time stopped, I think, for both of us, as I saw recognition in his eyes. "My God," Leahy murmured, "you're the young fellow who fell into the rhinoceros ceiling and met his lady love. By all that's wonderful, you're Roland Watkins." Because in fact, Rowley becomes extremely famous after he's found there and he's put on television. And for a time, because of the image that he sees in the shaft into which he falls, he's there in Time magazine and many other places. So his face, for a while, is well known. And so that moment of recognition leads to a lifetime's partnership in creating a new form of therapy. And here's a short passage talking about the premise. "You have to meet the bear in his true abode, not in a plausible zoo. What was sacralized in the caves was not art. It was not power or control or projection or fear mastered by image making, or prayers for fertility uttered in pigment. It was the inside of the earth, our mother, itself. In the deep cave, you are within the innards of the thing that pokes out towards the sky, the thing called world. You are on the other side of that thing, as if inhabiting the mold from which the world is made. In this place, the inside out shapes propose themselves, still locked in rock, like Michelangelo's tormented visions. You might trace these shapes with your fingers. They are the womb of time, the prototypes, nature's trial and error. What a privilege it must have seemed once to man to penetrate the earth and play inside the machinery. This was the furnace, the factory. Here half-formed, partly drafted creatures bulged in the cave's intestinal corridors like speculations, like nature's dreaming thoughts. To trace and touch them was to share in the power and the very process of creation. Here in this colorless world were God's drawings, the mother's drawings, her sketchpad. We enter the cave, feel our way along and down like persons navigating their own esophagus and descending into their own intestines. Here a bump, there a tump, a liver, a spleen, an antelope, an ibex, a thing that might, with our help, our intuition, become a rhinoceros. We leave our mark. Kilroy was here. We hold up a tiny juniper-fused candle and we daub. Our job is to lend to whatever we can glimpse as outline or relief, perspective, color. We are preparing the underworld for its life on the surface of the earth. We are the elves, wrapping the presents, dinging away with our little Nibelungen picks. We can feel earth, breathing, heaving, sick of our interference. It will spit us out once more, and as we reach the surface, that heavenly fragrance of vegetation known to the sun assails us like newborns. Alas, for the hospital-born, whose first smell is Lysol. For what must it be like to breathe in for the first time a field, mud, grass, a country breeze? We have known again briefly what it is to be inside life, as animals are. Now we are out, we are witnesses again, our bodies are kind of stick-like necessary joke appended to our brain pans. We go back to watching. But the secret of coming and going is ours. We know how to return to the mother, feed at her breast, and cry once more at our weaning, mingling joy and loss. So out of intuitions of this kind, Paddy and Rowley, with the help of a hypnotherapist from whom they both learn the art, take people down to the deep caves to spend a night there, and send them back under hypnosis to re-experience the terrors and the revelations that the deep caves provide them with. If I may, I wanted to end with a little section because I haven't read it for a while, and it will take us out into the light in a more humorous vein, which is the book's mode more than anything else. Among the lovers that Rowley's mother has is an American called Andy. One of the problems with being a novelist is that even in the small circle that one might have of readers, the immediate presumption is that these people are your own family, and people have been coming up to me and saying, "What an interesting childhood you must have had with a mother who had all these lovers." My poor mama. So, not so. Now, this is about Andy, and I wanted to read it because some of you are not old enough to remember this kind of American, and he was so important to the world and to me in my generation. Everyone liked the American. No one resented the fact that, this actually starts, if I may, a little earlier. The summer I was 10, an American called Andy, I must have known his last name once, but it's well and truly gone now, was Maman's cher ami, and he squired us round Provence, making Maman feel in the nicest way possible that she was a stranger in her own country. It wasn't so much that he knew France better than she did, although he did, but that he was more rapidly at home anywhere he went than any visitor one could possibly imagine. Before Maman and I had unpacked, Andy always seemed to have made friends of half the village. More to the point, they had felt happy to share the latest gossip with him. To them, he wasn't a stranger, he was an American. In that sense, Andy's art was almost involuntary. It was a state of soul. He was an American and therefore at home everywhere, not only in his own eyes, but in other people's. How hard that is to imagine today. These days, you could say exactly the opposite. Now that to be an American is to be at home nowhere outside America. Even in America, of course, you'd want to have the right skin color and bank balance. But these post-war American travelers, they weren't tourists, were a breed whose like I suspect the world has never seen nor will see again. They had won the war, an important factor, less with their soldiers than with lipstick and jazz. It was American culture, more than American metal, that had emerged triumphant from the horrors of World War II. Hollywood über alles. Everyone on the face of the earth wanted a piece of it, and as a result, these casual conquistadores, my American Andys and his ilk, never had to advertise their superiority. Many of them, like Andy himself, were wealthy, but you'd never have known it. At home, they drove a Corvette, but in Europe, they rented an old rattletrap, or even hitchhiked. Nothing fazed them. They dressed with an apparent disregard for chic that almost threatened to embarrass stylish company, until you realized that the old beret, the T-shirt with a pack of camels like an extra bicep in the sleeve, the faded chinos and the sandals were the perfect elegant disguise. Only Andy at an expatriate gathering could tell you where to meet the local gendarme at his favorite table and sort out a technicality over coffee, or where to find the best mechanic and how much and how little to give him as a tip. In this respect, too, the Andys were like a reverse image of the next wave of their countrymen, the forever willing but clumsy American tourists who stuck out like a sore thumb. Finding Andy in a town in France of Italy was not a job for the eye. L'Américain, you'd ask, il est où? A smile and a shrug came as the reply. Perhaps he's in the cafe in the square, or playing boule with Jacques and his sons, or, with an accompanying wink, collecting pissenlit with Josiane in the fields to garnish her mother's salad tonight at the Hôtel de France. Everyone liked the American. No one resented the fact that all the girls wanted to get their hands on him any more than they would if Hercules had come through town. L'Américain spoke an astonishingly idiomatic French in a terrible accent, which pleased the natives on both counts. The idiomatic accuracy was a tribute to their locality, and for anyone, even an American, to try and sound like a Frenchman would be an insulting absurdity. L'Américain was tact itself, while remaining enchantingly odd. To put it another way, every such American was Donald Sutherland, the loose-limbed actor whose screen persona evoked a calmly hip eccentricity devoid of hippie fads. This was possible because America at that moment, by the mid-60s this dispensation was fading fast, was, for Europeans, its fabled self. It was what both sides of the Atlantic Ocean had once declared it to be, the New World. We knew this from the movies and from magazines. For us, behind every idling Andy lay an America of gleaming household gadgets, of automats, of elevated urban trains and futuristic fashions. One didn't necessarily want to go there. Was it heaven or was it hell? But it was the investment capital of which these charming American gypsies spent the interest, by showing us what it was like in spirit and not in goods to belong to the future. They traveled light in every way. They brought no burden of national woes. They had none. They were Americans. They brought no gleaming machinery. They didn't need to. They were on holiday among the peasants, yet without the faintest hint of condescension, because they too, these strangely déclassé Americans, were hayseeds. You only had to look at Andy sprawling in a cafe or on a roadside verge to see that he was at home in the humblest circumstances. Yet wasn't he also secretly, invisibly, an aristocrat of the New World? His serenity, his wit, his cheerful bearing, he had come down from another planet, really, and his flying saucer was probably behind a haystack just outside the village. And his perpetual ability to fit in while remaining utterly unlike everyone else bespoke another race of men, Homo Americanus. We had always known, we Europeans, that the future must arrive one day in a form that would make us feel utterly passé, and here it was. How kind he was, this spaceman in casual clothes. How attractive, how utterly alien. No luncheon was complete without him. Andy himself, a rangy, tanned man with a broad mouth and a long, lean, muscular face. I think I was sort of seeing Henry Miller as I was constructing him. Always stretched, in my memory at least, into soft smiles. Was a banker at home, in real life, I was going to say, or something equally prosperous and bland. But he liked to come and drift across summertime France in his beret, like some kind of latter-day Henry Miller. I see, I owned up to it, I see. His passion was sketching, and he had mastered a curiously schematic style in which everything he drew, landscapes, seascapes, and people, were turned into a neat geometric shorthand, recognizable as who or what they were, but even more recognizable as Andy drawings. I've often wondered whether he was in fact rather good, or had simply evolved a charmingly deft way of rendering what he saw, like the kind of party trick which enables show-offs to turn dinner napkins into hats. Andy wrote poetry too, and Maman told me years later when I mentioned his name that some of his poems have been published in, I think, the Paris Review. It might have been the Transatlantic Review, unless that's a name in a journal I've just invented. Whatever this journal was, it meant little to me as a teenager. Looking back, the accomplishment seems rather impressive, and I can well believe that he was a richly gifted amateur in a number of fields. He would have preferred to keep it that way. To be his kind of American was to be an amateur by definition. Even his languid movements as he smoked a cigarette suggested that to be a professional, whether at poetry or tennis, smacked of desperation. The art was to do it effortlessly and only when the spirit moved you. Do I sound as if I'm describing a certain kind of understated British panache? Yet I'm not. This was precisely the glory, once upon a time, of the American abroad. No sweat. That was his devise. I never remember Andy hurrying. He never put himself under pressure. So what if you miss the train? There'll be another. Perhaps it's from Andy that I learnt my own cavalier way with time. Leisure, not victory, was the goal of life, and to be truly American was to be at ease at all times and in all places. Even after Maman had met Gottfried and her winter dance card was booked, and even after she had met the peripatetic Carlo and replaced Gottfried with him, Andy would look us up when he was in Paris and take us out for ice cream like a favorite uncle. When Gildo came on the scene, I think Andy swiftly intuited that uncles were not a comfortable feature of a Gildo world. This is the unfortunate bipolar paranoid schizophrenic. And receded as gracefully as ever. No sweat, Evie. Into the shadows. Thank you. I should mention, in the cause of complete transparency, that although you can buy this book at appalling expense, you can also have the first part of it. The e-book version has sensibly reduced this to 3 books. It is actually 3 books inside there. They're marked off as 1, 2, 3. And the first one is available free. As a free download for the next 3 days. Today's the second day of a 5-day promotion. And so it's there. If you feel you've heard enough to want to nibble at it and read the first part, and then you can decide whether you're prepared to pay, not very exorbitantly, but pay the e-price for a Kindle volume if you're a Kindle reader. But the paperback itself is available if your wrists are equally prepared. I know it's a problem. I always feel bad. People always say, but I can't read it in bed, and I don't know what to do about it. Write shorter books. I don't know. As you may know, this is some of you I know this. It's one of 7 books I wrote in a year, this monster. And a wonderful British writer friend, Rose Tremaine, said, please do try to write more slowly. And she wasn't being sweetly ironic. This could have been a sweet compliment. It wasn't. She really meant you'd write an awful lot better. And I couldn't bring myself to say the truth, which is I've forgotten how to do that. It's a hard thing to do. I could walk more slowly if somebody said, now stop that, or eat more slowly. Stop that. But the words are there, and it seems the more root thing. Does anybody want to ask anything about this book? George is right in front of me, who is responsible for this book. I've said this to him before, and he naturally, there's no reason why he should be responsible for this book. But it belongs to the class of memories that may be completely false, which in my case is most of my memories are totally unreliable. And the way I remember it, perhaps a bit mistake, is that I was at the party at George and Susie's, and a noble-looking fellow appeared across the room, and I asked George who he was, and George told me, and I asked what he did. And George, in this fantasy, said he's a psychotherapist. So I said, interesting. What kind? In this version of reality, George said, I don't really know. And at that moment, it came to me, because I spent so much of my writing life writing psychotherapists that are more or less Freudian or post-Freudian, neo-Freudians now. But what I really want to do is invent a new kind of therapy. And so I left the party intoxicated by this absurd idea, and with the vision of that man who became very popular. And then I thought, what the heck is a new kind of psychotherapy? And it becomes famous in the book. It becomes fashionable in New York and London and Paris. And people go and they go, they're lowered down to the shaft of the caves in southwest France. And one Texan billionaire becomes really interested in it. They lower him down, like lowering a pig into the cave. And he dies, but he loves this therapy, and he left them a small